Cosmology and director of Institute of Cosmology and Gravitation. In 2019, he joined the University of Waterloo as a professor and director of the Waterloo Center of Astrophysics, and he's also an associate faculty member of Parameter Institute of Theoretical Physics. His research centers on using large-scale galaxy surveys to constrain cosmological models with a particular focus on baryon acoustic oscillations and redshift space distortion. He has played a leading role in major international collaborations, including this Sloan Digital Sky Survey, SDSS, the Dark Energy Spectrography Instrument, DESI, and the Euclid mission. He's widely recognized for his contribution to precision measurement of cosmic expansion and has significantly advanced the use of galaxy clustering as a probe of dark energy in cosmological model. So please, we'll take it in.
Okay, thank you. Okay, everybody hear me okay? All right. I am quite an informal lecturer, so please shout out your questions. If you don't have time to get the microphone, I will repeat them for people online. So I've got 4 lectures, and firstly, this is not going to be enough to tell you all of the cosmology that you can get from a galaxy redshift survey, because there's a whole wealth of cosmology, but also because when I lecture, I tend to go off on a tangent, and I've outdone myself for these 4 lectures because I'm going to go off on a tangent for one of those whole lectures, even before I've started talking. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 2 lectures today, which are sort of background physics lectures, the physics that goes to all of this. Not all of it, just some of it that we'll need tomorrow. And then tomorrow, for my first lecture, I'm going to concentrate on statistics. I will try and make it interesting before you all worry too much. But I'm not going to go back to the basics of statistics. I'm going to assume you all have a basic knowledge. But I'm going to talk about Bayesian methods, frequentist methods, basically the new methods that are being used now, and pretty much everything I think you need to know as background to understand things like dynamical dark energy, why we think it exists, what are the different ways we're testing it. And then for the final lecture, the 4th lecture, I'm going to tell you about the latest results from DESI, which is more my standard seminar. Okay, everybody got the plan? Good. All right, thank you at the back. Excellent. So, cosmology from galaxy surveys. Whenever I'm asked by the media, I say that a galaxy redshift survey is a goldmine of information. I've said it so much now that I'm surprised they will still print it, but they do like it. And this image is actually why I think this is the case. I'm going off on a tangent immediately, but I did a PhD defense maybe a couple of months ago, and the PhD student had actually put this in their thesis. They had got this from one of my old lectures and cut this diagram into my thesis, and I wasn't quite sure what to do when I'm examining it, because I think it's a really good representation of it, but then it's also mine. Okay, so anyway, right, back off my tangent. Galaxy survey. Galaxies cluster, they're not distributed randomly, they've got all these wonderful patterns. You all know there are filaments, walls, there are voids where there are no galaxies, there are clusters where there are many galaxies together. All of this in co-moving space forms the galaxy power spectrum. I've put here the recombination. It's really the post-recombination, because this period that produces all the oscillations in the CMB also produces features in the galaxy power spectrum. If, with the galaxy survey, that was all we could get, it was just the distribution of galaxies in co-moving space, galaxy surveys would not be a goldmine for cosmology. The answer is that as well as having that co-moving clustering, we also see galaxies in projection. We don't just get the galaxies in co-moving distances given to us, we get them in angles and redshifts. And we do this at a sequence of different redshifts. So it's a very powerful way, as I will show, of getting the evolution of the universe through the distance redshift relationship, through the Hubble parameter. We also, and this is in some ways a pain, but actually it's a good thing as well, don't just get the expansion of the universe. We can look at peculiar velocities within it. We can see the growth of structure, because, as I'm sure you're all aware, as for galaxy redshifts, they're not just driven by the cosmological expansion rate, they also are driven by the peculiar velocities, the growth of structure, and we'll go into that a little bit as well later. We can get neutrino masses. I'm not going to cover this in great detail. You've already had a number of lectures on neutrinos. Primordial non-Gaussianity, we can actually look at inflation. The physics of inflation, particularly how it produced fluctuations in the universe, that is encoded in this distribution as well, as is a lot of the physics that we just heard about in the last 2 lectures. And we can answer things like, is the universe isotropic? Is it homogeneous? So I've taken a lot of time over this. That's because it's a goldmine. There's a lot to say. Here it is pictorially. You can see, here's the co-moving power spectrum. It's pretty boring. And actually, it's not of a great deal of interest because almost all of the physics that you could get out of the co-moving power spectrum is there in the cosmic microwave background, and the cosmic microwave background, as we also heard earlier today, does it cleaner. But really key thing is this idea of projection, is the idea of also looking at the growth of structure, and then looking at galaxies as well. And if anybody has an image that they think conveys isotropy and homogeneity, please let me know, because I was really struggling, and so this is just Copernicus. It's not a very good pictorial representation, but there you go. Okay, so we're just going to concentrate on these in this lecture. Okay, clustering. Going back to basics, because I was formerly a mathematician and I like everything to be complete. I'm sure you all know this, so just look at your email for a little minute while I go through the motions. Clustering, you can think of it, everybody should have a mental picture for where the physics is coming from when you actually are analyzing something or reading a paper or doing. And for clustering, I think the best mental picture for you to have is the idea of throwing down sticks into a galaxy survey and asking what's the probability that you would find a pair of galaxies with one galaxy at each end of that stick, in a small volume element at the end of that stick, compared to if they were randomly distributed in that space with the same selection function as your galaxy survey. If there are more pairs of galaxies as a function of your stick length, you can say that the universe, the galaxy sample, is clustered on the scale of that stick length. If there are fewer pairs of galaxies compared to random, then it's anti-clustered, it's unclustered on that scale. And formally, what you've done by thinking about throwing down these sticks is you've defined the correlation function. It's the excess probability of finding pairs of galaxies in a small volume element, dV1, dV2, at both ends of a stick of length r, compared to random. Okay. Now, quite often, we don't think of it in terms of pairs of galaxies separated by sticks. We think of it as the overdensity field, which is just the density of galaxies normalized by the expected density. Quite often you might hear me say that we use a random catalog. That's because the expected density is quite often quantified by a random catalog, a distribution that's like the galaxies in terms of the space it fills, but it has no clustering. And you can create this relatively straightforwardly if you know the parameters of your survey, which you usually do very well. So in terms of delta, the correlation function is the 2-point function. It's the expected value of delta at one end of the stick multiplied by delta at the other end of the stick, where r is the stick vector of the stick. The Fourier analog, the Fourier transform of the correlation function is the power spectrum. If you want a mental picture when you're looking at a power spectrum, think about not throwing down sticks, but throwing down Fourier waves. And asking, do the galaxies line up with that Fourier wave? You can move it in phase, but you're asking about the amplitude along that particular Fourier wave. And then you can carry on this mental picture through to 3-point functions where you've got 3 of these deltas. You're looking not just about fluctuations in basically 2 points, but in 3 points as well, and so on. Okay. So, thanks to Copernicus, we're reasonably sure that our universe is statistically homogeneous and statistically isotropic. A lot of people are interested on the scale at which this happens. It happens gradually. As you look on larger and larger scales, the universe gets more and more isotropic and homogeneous. We stay at statistically homogeneous and isotropic because we know that the universe is not actually isotropic and homogeneous. I mean, we are here, we're living proof that we're not spread uniformly over space. So this correlation function, statistical isotropy and homogeneity in terms of the correlation function, comes down to the sticks again. Isotropy basically says I don't care in what orientation my stick is in. Homogeneity means I don't care where my stick is. I should have the same statistic in the end. And so your correlation function, here's a correlation function of galaxies. This is actually the Sloan-Boss sample. This is actually just the number of pairs of a different separation, thinking about throwing down sticks into the survey. This is the power spectrum of the same sample. And again, statistical isotropy and homogeneity. Now they mean that the power spectrum is a function just of the wave number, not its vector components. You should be aware that power spectrum has units of volume, unless you write it in dimensionless form, that very few people do, because this form actually shows more features in plots, pretty much. Okay. So here is the power spectrum. Now, the CMB tells you a projected two-dimensional power spectrum of light fluctuations from the last scattering surface. The galaxies tell you a three-dimensional power spectrum of density fluctuations at lower redshifts. But you can basically convert from one to the other using models. You can put them all on the same kind of plot, and you can get the idea of how structure in the universe is distributed over basically a wide range of scales in the universe. And you see there's a turnover. This is the matter radiation scale turnover. There are oscillations that you can't quite easily see in this picture. I don't know why I'm carrying around this clicker to change slides, because I seem to be walking back to my laptop every time I do it. The two-point functions, correlation function and power spectrum, they are not statistically complete for the evolved density field. The nonlinear field on small scales looks very different from the linear field. In particular, there is a strong bispectrum component. There are strong higher order terms. If galaxies are rattling around in their halo, they no longer tell you about the initial structures. Even on large scales, we're assuming that the universe has random phases, and that, the power spectrum, if we had correlated phases, would look very different. So we know that structure grows in the universe. The power spectrum grows in amplitude, but if you go through the linear growth equations, I hope you've all done that previously in graduate lectures at your home institutions, then you know that there's a scale-independent linear growth on large scales. What that means for the power spectrum is the power spectrum just goes up in amplitude whilst retaining the same shape. Whereas on nonlinear scales, you see the excess power in the power spectrum coming in. And there was an interesting paper by Lado Samushia recently, and he looked at the information content of the power spectrum in evolved galaxy fields. Let me just take you through this plot. This is Kmax, as in the Fourier mode of the wavelength you're throwing down into the galaxy survey. This is cumulative Fisher information, basically including everything up to that Kmax in the power spectrum. How much information is there? The dotted line is the nonlinear power spectrum, the dashed line is the linear power spectrum, and this solid line is the bispectrum. So what's happening here? Well, on linear scales, the nonlinear power spectrum looks like the linear power spectrum, so they both contain roughly the same amount of information. But on nonlinear scales, the nonlinear power spectrum has wiped out the cosmological information that would still be there if the power spectrum was linear, and so there's less information in the nonlinear power spectrum than there would be in the linear one. But the really weird thing is that the bispectrum contains more information on these small scales than the linear power spectrum would have done. So somehow the universe has gained information on small scales about cosmology beyond that was there in the linear power spectrum. The answer to this is that we're getting information not from the clustering in co-moving space, but instead from these projection effects. The fact that basically we measure angles and redshifts and we have to convert them into distances. And there is actually a lot of information in that. We're picking up information about the distance redshift relationship from the projection that is not there in the co-moving power spectrum. Okay, introduction to galaxy clustering, yeah. Oh.
Yeah, so regarding your previous plot, I was wondering about that bispectrum. You're not considering the one halo term?
Well, firstly, this is not my work. Okay. What do you mean the one halo?
Sorry. I mean, my understanding might be wrong. Is when you see the nonlinear power spectrum, it's because you're considering the 1 and a 2 halo term. And I guess when you do the triangles, you can consider also that effect.
So you can consider it. This is cosmological information, not information about galaxy formation and evolution. So basically, once you've got your galaxies rattling around inside a halo, you've lost the cosmological information. Because if you imagine running simulations of different cosmologies, those halos might look very similar, or at least more similar in those different simulations than they would do in the linear power spectrum. And I think that's what this is showing. Okay. All right. Okay. Baryon acoustic oscillations, I'm going to take a little bit of time to go through these because they're one of the fundamental and key pieces of projection information that we can get from a galaxy survey. If you've seen this series of plots before, again, feel free to do your email, check Facebook, whatever you do. Otherwise, let us consider the universe post-inflation containing one density spike. This density spike includes dark matter, baryonic material, radiation, neutrinos, and it's a hypothetical universe. It's a hypothetical universe where everything is isotropic around this one density spike. And this is a series of plots that show this is the mass profile, so it's r squared rho, which is where it goes down to 0 in the middle. It's of a pretty standard lambda CDM universe. And we're now considering the universe at 110 years old, a redshift of 82,000, we have this density spike. As we evolve the universe, what we see is that the neutrinos, they feel the gravity of this density, but they're not in any way coupled to it, so they're going to free stream out from this perturbation. The dark matter only feels the gravity of the perturbation, and basically that's going to grow, but it's going to stay pretty much centralized on where the perturbation was. It will also feel the gravity of the baryonic and the baryonic material and the radiation, which is doing something a lot more interesting. Because the baryonic material and the photons, they're coupled together through Compton scattering. They basically form a hot plasma. And the radiation pressure in this hot plasma can blow out this spherical shell. This spherical shell, at a redshift of around 1,000, basically we have decoupling. Compton scattering breaks down. The photons are now free from the baryons. They are basically not now constrained as to the speed with which they can go out, and they can free stream away. And they leave behind a universe at a redshift of 500, where the dark matter and the baryons are reasonably decoupled in terms of their positions in space. The dark matter has this density profile around where you had an original density spike. The baryonic material is in a spherical shell around it, and the photons and the neutrinos are basically free streaming away from this structure. The distance that this spherical shell gets to is called the co-moving sound horizon at recombination. It's basically how far the sound wave, this photon pressure driven spherical wave, could get to before the photons free stream out from the material and leave the spherical shell in place. Then from a redshift of basically, the redshift 1,000 onwards, the dark matter and the baryons both only interact and feel gravity. And the gravity pulls the perturbations together. These are small density fluctuations on an otherwise very dense distribution of material. And so gravity will basically attract both species into the overall profile, basically the potential that can be got by summing together the potentials of the baryonic and the dark matter material. And you have this growing together. So if you want to actually create a true simulation, someone asked this earlier, starting at very high redshift, you have to do it in a way that's quite different from how you would run a simulation these days, by having your baryonic material and your dark matter have different fields initially. But by a redshift of 10, which is where basically we see the earliest galaxies these days, then we're left with this distribution of baryonic material and dark matter that all have roughly the same distribution in space, with this profile around every original perturbation that's an original bump where you had the original perturbation, and this spherical shell around it. Quick question.
That we would not see the accumulation of baryons together at very small radii?
So the question is, if we didn't have dark matter in the universe, we wouldn't see the accretion of baryons grouping together at small radii. And I think we would do. You can certainly run CAM with baryon-only solutions, and you can see the power spectrum that you end up with. But what you've got to realize is that all of the material had this original spherical wave blowing out. And so everything will be found in those rings, if you like, and nothing in the center. No, okay, so it is homogeneous, as I'll show in my next slide, because now you've got to, in your mind, superimpose this idea of a single density spike that we've just talked about onto a field of perturbations post-inflation. And now you've got to imagine, and this is a movie showing it, spherical waves blowing out from every density perturbation. And in your baryon case, you would only have those spherical waves. Okay. So what we're left with is a distribution of galaxies that has this imprint of this physical effect happening in the pre-recombination universe, such that when we look at a galaxy survey, we see an excess of pairs of galaxies separated by 120 megaparsecs in co-moving space. There are more galaxies at the ends of sticks if your stick is 120 megaparsecs long, compared to your stick being 100 megaparsecs long or 140 megaparsecs long. So it is actually pretty cool that in the galaxy distribution today, we see the imprint of this physics happening in the early universe. The co-moving sound horizon is actually a reasonably simple calculation. Nobody does it, obviously, because you've got CAM to do it for you. But if you sit down and did it, it's basically just the sound speed that this spherical shell is moving out, normalized by the evolution of the universe over the period for which it's moving out. Okay. So this process, this spherical shell blowing out, is the same process that produces acoustic peaks in the CMB. When that radiation free streamed away from the perturbations, that radiation is the radiation that's going off to cause the cosmic microwave background. And the perturbations that it's free streaming from are still the perturbations in radiation that you see in the cosmic microwave background. So if you equate the CMB-Ls to large-scale structure Ks, very simply, and you draw vertical lines down from all the peaks in the CMB, then there is a coherence between those lines and the peaks that you see in the BAO in the galaxy power spectrum. There is a pi/2 offset because the peaks in the CMB correspond to density peaks in the radiation, whereas the peaks in the large-scale structure are where the velocity peaks, and that's where it's going to grow. There is also a 2D anisotropic projection because you are projecting 3D density waves onto the last scattering surface to produce the cosmic microwave background. But when you allow for those two, which again, something like CAM, CMB fast will do, you get that there is this coherence. Was there a question here, or did I answer it?
It was just on the previous slide, you had said that.
I was just curious, from the previous slide, you had said that the sound horizon, or the BAO wavelength is determined primarily by the co-moving sound horizon. I was just wondering, why is that an approximation? Does it have to do with like there being different modes of the oscillation or something else?
Okay, that's a good question. I was skipping over that. It's co-moving sound horizon at recombination, but we have something that's called baryon drag epoch, which is a made-up epoch because this wave carries on moving slightly afterwards because of basically momentum of the baryons, even after the radiation has departed. And so the sound horizon that we see imprinted in the galaxies is not exactly the sound horizon of recombination. It's the sound horizon at a made-up epoch called baryon drag, which is basically the epoch at which this wave will get to. Good question, though. Don't be afraid to ask these questions. Good. Okay, so this description I've told you of spherical waves moving out of perturbations is describing the same physics that the description of balls on springs in potential wells describes. Balls on springs in potential wells, where you are balancing gravitational attraction against radiation pressure and seeing how many perturbations you have before decoupling, is just the Fourier equivalent of thinking of waves moving out. If you take the Fourier transform of a sharp spike, you get a sinc function. You can think of the description I've given you in terms of spherical waves moving out as the sharp spike description, and then the idea of gravitational attraction being balanced by pressure for different wavelengths is the sinc function description, where you're looking at Fourier waves of different wavelengths. So this idea that basically you get a trough in the C and B power spectrum where you've had just enough time for the gravity to pull the balls in, radiation to push them out, and then reach recombination, says that you get a trough on that wavelength. That is the trough in Fourier space that corresponds to this spherical shell moving out. So it's a great example of having two different physical descriptions that give you different insights in different ways, but are describing the same physics. Okay. So the power of baryon acoustic oscillations for a galaxy survey is that they can be used as a standard ruler. We can have this projection of them, not just that they're there in the co-moving power spectrum. And basically, we get this in practice because when we measure a whole series of angles and redshifts, we want to convert them into co-moving space, which means we use a model. And if that model was wrong, we would see a projected out universe that didn't look like what we expected it to. This is where the universe gets slightly more interesting, because although we think the universe is homogeneous and isotropic, we observe it in what we call redshift space, and we observe it in different ways along and across the line of sight. Across the line of sight, these positions come from angles, and along the line of sight, they come from redshifts. So the universe gives us very different information when we look at a galaxy survey along the line of sight compared to across the line of sight. And so when we look at the correlation function, although I showed you 1D correlation functions and told you that was just stick length irrespective of what direction it's in practice, that correlation function looks different depending on where the stick is, the angle of the stick compared to the line of sight. And so instead of a 1D correlation function, we should have a 2D correlation function, where we have the components of the stick along and across the line of sight, and our BAO feature is not a bump, but is a spherical ring. Sorry, a circular ring. And so I'll come on to this in lecture 3, but I'd forgotten I made this graphic, sorry. When you're looking through your slides, these movies never work, and you just think, oh, that's fine, it's a circle, not some distracting large circle keeps blowing up. But if you could ignore the expanding circle, what we do, instead of trying to analyze this full 2D correlation function as a function of perpendicular and parallel separations, we instead decompose into moments. We decompose into the monopole, which just means we spherically average all of the basically angles. And this is the 1D correlation functions I showed before. But we also look at the quadrupole and hexadecapole moments because we know that there's symmetry around the line of sight. Positive and negative mu should give us the same answer. So there's only really importance to look at the even moments. And so we can decompose that 2D pattern into basically a monopole and a quadrupole. These are measurements again from SDSS. I think I should update this now to DESI, but they're measurements at different redshifts of both the monopole and the quadrupole, showing the BAO features. So because we see angles and redshifts, because this information is different, we actually get different information from the baryon acoustic oscillations along and across the line of sight. In the radial direction, we measure the Hubble parameter. And in the angular direction, we measure the angular diameter distance. And the way to think of this is that basically along the line of sight, what we're actually measuring is a delta Z. And we're comparing it to a model which is a delta D, and dd by dz is the Hubble parameter. Whereas in the angular direction, what we're measuring is an angular separation of galaxies with this preferred separation. And when we convert that and compare it to models in co-moving distance, we need to worry about the angular diameter distance. And if we use a fiducial cosmology to do the conversion between redshifts and a cosmological model, then those projected correlation functions, bumps in the correlation function, will depend on what the truth is compared to that fiducial model we've used. And if our fiducial model doesn't actually match that of the universe, our baryon acoustic oscillations will be offset from the expected truth. Okay. So one trick that we do is so-called reconstruction. So here's another evolution plot, this time of the correlation function as a function of redshift. And this is the redshift 3 correlation function. This is the redshift 0 correlation function. On large scales, you see linear growth. The amplitude of the correlation function is just increasing with linear growth. And on small scales, you see nonlinear growth, and the BAO, if you can see, it's being smoothed out. And what's happening here is that the nonlinear motions of small-scale structure growth are basically spreading out the material that would have been in this spherical shell. So this is easier to see in 2D. There's a great series of plots that's in this Padmanabhan paper. And this is basically putting into practice this idea of having this spherical shell moving out from a single perturbation. This is the initial conditions. These are all the matter perturbations that would be in that spherical shell. These are the matter perturbations that would be in that center. And then you run the n-body simulation, you look where those little bits of matter end up in nonlinear field at the low redshift. And you see that as well as basically increasing in amplitude, building up this structure, what was originally a nice spherical, clean, narrow spherical shell has now become a broad, spread out series of distributions of matter in the universe. And this is why that peak gets spread out, basically. If you imagine trying to measure the pairs of galaxies between the center and this spherical ring around it, you can see that those pairs will be more spread out here than here. And what was realized, Daniel Eisenstein, 2006, wrote a very influential paper on this, is that we know roughly how this smoothing out happens because we know the field of perturbations. We know if there's basically a cluster of galaxies just outside this ring, that galaxies will have moved towards it. And if we know that, we can move them back. So we can use this information about the nonlinear actual field, the phase information, if you like, to move those perturbations back into that tight spherical ring and increase our BAO peak back to what it should be in the linear field. Why do we do that? Well, if we're using BAO as a standard ruler, what's important to do is to centroid the peak. And you can centroid a peak a lot better if you have a sharp peak compared to a smooth peak. You'll find its location a lot easier. This works incredibly well. In fact, the algorithm to do it is very simple. You basically smooth the field. You do a step of an n-body simulation with that smooth field and say, where would everything go next if this was an n-body simulation? And then you say, okay, well, that's where it's come from. Let's move it back. And you don't just move the galaxies back, which would tend to basically even out the material. You move the overdensities back, so you keep the amplitude of the overdensity field, but you've just moved everything back in position so that it looks more like where this spherical shell was in the linear field. And this is basically become a mainstay of surveys like DESI doing this. People worry that in some way we're putting in information into the field. Actually, if you do things wrong, and people have done lots of tests on this, there are various papers I can point you to, really what happens is that you just don't reconstruct as well. You end up still with a smooth bump, not a sharp bump. Okay, it works well on mocks. And the improvement from reconstruction is like 50% in terms of the answers you get.
Yeah. Well, when performing the BO reconstruction, well, a theory needs to be assumed, right? So let's say, for example, that you have to assume general relativity to move the particle back. So my question is how much this model assumption affects the final cosmological constraint, and especially when searching for deviation from GR, because if you assume GR, you are basically like...
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a fair and good question. I think the answer would be if you are trying to compare these results against a model, and in that model reconstruction would not work, or it would give you a very different result, then you shouldn't be using the post-reconstruction answer. You should be using the pre-reconstruction answer. So yes, if you want to take the BAO from DESI and use them to compare your models, you should do that with your mind open about what's been done to the data to get to those results. And if what's been done to the data would not work in that model that you're testing, you should not test it. Yeah, that's fair. There's another question.
Velocities and bulk velocities in these reconstructions were, so how do you measure?
Yeah. Okay. So the question was, do we use bulk velocities, peculiar velocities in these reconstructions? In fact, it turns out that peculiar velocities are a little bit of a pain in these reconstructions. We have to allow for large scale, well, firstly, we smooth the field, so we're not worried about nonlinear velocities. We're only worried about basically the large scale redshift space distortions, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. We do have to, when we look at the field and we work out what the displacement should be, allow for the fact that it is a redshift space field and include that in the calculation of what the displacement should be. And so in that sense, the increased amplitude in the clustering that we can measure because of redshift space distortions actually help us. And then there is a choice of, in this field, which is the reconstructed field, do we do that in redshift space or real space? And in fact, it doesn't make a great deal of difference to the signal to noise you get out in the end. And so the tendency at the moment is to do the simplest thing and not correct it, because we don't have to. Okay, yeah, good, thank you. Okay. Okay, so there are many, many different, so I wrote this slide a long time ago, so apologies if anybody here has released a reconstruction routine post-2017. There are many different possible ways of improving this reconstruction, And if you want to apply one of these, you pretty much have to balance, which is a balance we all have to do in science, simple routine that works and gets most of the signal versus complex routine that you might worry about a little bit more in terms of bringing information in that might improve things by a few percent. Okay. How are we doing for time? Who's timing me?
We are overtime.
Oh, really? I was rather hoping you'd say there are 10 minutes left. 2 minutes. Oh, perfect. All right, no questions then. We'll move swiftly on. So we've talked a little bit about redshift-based distortions. These are just formal slides. When you look at the universe and you are using redshifts to convert to distances, and because these redshifts come both from the Hubble flow and the peculiar velocity, then when you calculate a distance, it is not the true distance to the galaxy. And this is something sometimes people forget. It's very difficult because we're so used to working in redshift space to remember that this is not real. The true universe we do think is homogeneous and isotropic. It's just the redshift space universe, which is what we look at when we convert straight from redshifts to galaxies. So in redshift space, we typically use S to represent an redshift space distance, R in real space, and we have this velocity term which shifts the galaxy. There are some really great things about RSD. One is that galaxies act as test particles in the flow of matter. So the actual shift from RSD doesn't care if your galaxy was blue or red, apologies. Doesn't care if it's luminous or not. It will have the same shift in distance between real and redshift space. In that sense, this is very clean. One might worry, and people have done a lot of tests and shown that this doesn't matter too much, is that the distribution of galaxy velocities that you pick up in redshift space for a population doesn't match the distribution of velocities from the whole population of different places in the universe. But again, that works remarkably well. And so what we're doing is we're transferring into the redshift space density power spectrum some of the velocity power spectrum. So as well as fluctuations in density in the universe, you can think of the velocity field in the XYZ directions in the universe, and you can think of calculating a power spectrum of those velocities. And those two are related in linear theory. The linear velocity comes from the linear perturbations. And this is a relationship between the linear power spectrum of velocities and the linear power spectrum of densities. There is a correction for the expansion of the universe. There is an F factor, which tells you the growth rate difference between the velocities and the density, but they are both related. And so hopefully you'll have seen a plot like this before. These are the two key regimes of interest for redshift space distortions. You've got to imagine you're looking from below here. You're looking at a void or an overdensity. There is coherent motion either out or into those objects. And because of that coherent motion in redshift space, you see those objects either stretched out for voids or collapsed in for clusters. Then on small scales within a halo, the galaxies are orbiting round. You will misinterpret those orbital motions as being due to the expansion of the universe. And in that case, on small scales, very small scales, you would stretch out objects along the line of sight, known as the finger of God effect. So when we see one of these plots, we see a squashing along the line of sight of what should be a spherical correlation function if the universe is isotropic and homogeneous. And the amount of this squashing tells us the velocity at which basically the structure is growing. Linear theory, I'm not going to go through this in any detail, just to say that basically this relationship between the linear velocity power spectrum and the linear density power spectrum means that basically you have a very simple description of the redshift space power spectrum compared to the real space power spectrum, where you've got a bias in real space, and in redshift space, you have mu squared F factor, where mu is this cos of the angle that the pair makes to the line of sight, or that the Fourier mode makes to the line of sight, and F is this logarithmic derivative of the growth rate that we saw before as being needed for this relationship between velocities and density. Okay. Redshift space distortion measurements, very good. They match lambda CDM. I've not updated this because unfortunately in DESI we didn't produce a nice plot like this, or at least I couldn't find it this morning. And I'm not going to tell you the later bit, but basically there is a question of why we're doing RSD measurements. What we're doing here is we're saying, is the velocity field in the universe consistent with the density field? It's a good thing to test, but actually in terms of information given, the only real interesting information that we get from RSD is the amplitude of the matter field itself through this F sigma 8 combination. And really, this is what we're going after, not adding this in to cosmological parameters. Okay, I'm going to skip all of that and just leave you with that. After the possibly now very short break, we will just talk about the Alcott-Paczynski effect and the Hubble parameter in more detail. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we can take a 5-minute break. Yeah.